innovations today.
And you don't have to pay.
Expert panels with advanced degrees are sure to satisfy your curiosity.
Did we mention it's free?
And if you think you'll find a better time than this, then come on down and test your hypothesis. Cause you're gonna learn a lot if you wanna stay down at the Science Cafe.
Welcome to Science Cafe, New Hampshire. We are past the midway point of our 11th season of providing a forum for the public and our experts to discuss a wide range of scientific topics. My name is Rick Irving, and I'll be your host and moderator for this, our February 2022 episode entitled, A Pollinator-Friendly Yard, What is it and How to Make it Your Own? Tonight's Science Cafe is about the critical role of pollinators in the lives of everyone who likes to eat and everybody who would like to beautify their yard. While we've all heard about the demise of honeybees, pollinators span a wide range of critters and are about much more than just bees. Wasps, butterflies, moths, beetles, even small mammals contribute to the process of pollination, and they work tirelessly to help keep us fed. So doesn't it make sense to spend a little time to appreciate more deeply the army of pollen movers out there and what we can do to help them thrive? This is a problem that many of us can help solve without even leaving our yard. Creating a pollinator-friendly yard is a worthy project and probably not that hard to do. Just a little more thought into plant selection and placement, or even just tolerating flowering weeds could make a difference. Tonight, our panel can help us understand all of this, from the basics of pollination to landscape design with intent. They have the knowledge and they are ready to answer all of your questions. However, before I introduce our panel, I have a few quick procedural comments for our audience, especially our first-time viewers. A vital part of Science Cafe are the questions submitted by you, our audience, for our expert panel. To submit your questions, use the comment section of Facebook or YouTube, whichever you are using right now to join us tonight. Our colleagues will collect the questions and forward them to us to direct them to the panel. Please be succinct with your questions, and if you would, please include your name and where you're joining us from. This information is for purely general interest purposes only. Since we have gone to this virtual format, we're able to reach a much wider audience, and it's interesting to see where your questions are coming from. You may start submitting your questions now and for the remainder of tonight's program. As always, we will get to as many of your questions as our time this evening permits. And now it is my privilege to introduce you to our panelists for tonight. Hi, and so let's start by introducing Ruth Droscher. Ruth is an advanced master gardener and volunteers with the University of New Hampshire Extension Program. She is joining us from Henniker, New Hampshire. Ruth, would you take a few minutes and tell us about yourself, your interests, your background, and so on?
Sure. It's actually Ruth Drescher, kind of like the nanny there,
Okay.
just a few extra letters. I am a advanced master gardener with the New Hampshire Extension. I'm also one of their natural resource steward members, both programs of which I highly recommend. I also work at our local garden center here in Henniker, that's Stone Falls Gardens, and I have a strong interest in planting for pollinators, planting for wildlife, birdscaping, native plants, and just finding a better way to garden that is still beautiful for humans, but also serves an ecological purpose as well.
Great, thank you, and thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Next, we have Kim Eierman. She is an environmental horticulturist and ecological landscape designer and founder of Eco Beneficial. She is joining us tonight from Westchester County, New York. Kim, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good evening. Well, I'm glad to hear Ruth's background because I can relate to that. My focus is using native plants to support our native species around us, including pollinators. And my company, Eco Beneficial, is designed to do just that. Do a lot of teaching at New York Botanical Garden, Brooklyn Botanic Garden, the Native Plant Center, and several other places. Do a lot of public speaking. And I am the author of the book, The Pollinator Victory Garden, Win the War on Pollinator Decline with Ecological Gardening. So I hope I'll be able to share some tips with you this evening.
Wow, that's fantastic. Again, thank you for joining us. Next, we have Gene Harrington. Gene is the manager of the Nashua Farmers Exchange. And with this third time appearance on the Science Cafe, he becomes our record holder for panelists. He's joining us tonight from Nashua, New Hampshire. Gene, tell us about yourself.
Well, technically, I'm in the London area right now, but
Okay.
yes, I've been promoting natural agriculture for well over 40 years in the southern New Hampshire area. I do believe that the best way to grow things is with Mother Nature rather than fighting Mother Nature. So I'm always out there trying to do whatever I can to help Mother Nature grow the things I would like.
Excellent. Thank you. And we also have Jackson Madnick. Jackson is an environmentalist and water resources and sustainability expert. He is joining us from Wayland, Massachusetts. Jackson, tell us about yourself, and thanks for being here.
Hi there. I'm following after my mother, Pearl, who was an avid gardener when I was little, and she cared about the environment greatly and cared about water. And so I've been giving a little under 200 talks all over the country and around the world. And I'm interested in pollinators and better grass, as opposed to all the terrible grass that's out there. And so I can talk about that and how we can be more organic and be healthier and help save the planet.
Great. Thank you, Jackson. Now we have our first question. It's going to be, why do plants need pollination? And let's start with Ruth.
Okay. Plants need pollination because not every single plant does, but the majority of them need pollination or pollinators to help them procreate. Basically, pollination is flower reproduction. So there needs to be some mechanism for getting the pollen to the ovules of the female parts of the plant. And there are some plants that will self-fertilize. They don't need any help. The wind does a pretty good job, especially for things like trees. So in next spring, when your car turns a lovely shade of mustard gold, don't blame the pollinators. You can blame the wind on that one. Those are your pine trees, specifically your male pine trees, doing their best to create more pine trees. But about 70% of our plants do need a helper that will transport the pollen from one blossom to the other. And a key point here is that the pollinators themselves have no clue really that that's what they're doing. They're there for a free meal. That's really all they care about. They want the pollen. They want the nectar. So over time, an evolutionary process has occurred that has made plants be more attractive to their particular pollinators, and for the pollinators themselves to be more efficient at gathering the pollen. And this has helped that particular type of plant reproduce, which perpetuates the cycle.
Interesting. Thank you. Anybody else? Ruth? I mean, Kim?
Well, yeah. So, I think actually, the updated numbers are about 80% or more of all plants on Earth need an animal pollinator to reproduce. There's also wind pollination, as Ruth mentioned, and pollination by water and some other kind of unusual things. But I think what Ruth was mentioning or alluding to were these pollination syndromes, these groups of floral traits, suites of floral traits that attract particular pollinators. So, for example, a bee won't necessarily be attracted to the same plant, the same flower that, say, a hummingbird would be attracted to, or be able to utilize that same plant. So while hummingbirds have evolved to really specialize in red tubular flowers, it's thought that they did so because there was a lot of competition from bees on certain plants. So it turns out that bees see on a different spectrum than we humans do. They see on a UV spectrum, and they don't particularly see red flowers against green foliage very well, but that's perfect for hummingbirds. So you can take a look online and see pollination syndromes. Look it up. It's in my book too, and see which types of pollinators are going to tend to use which type of flowers.
Oh, that's great. And since you mentioned your book, could you tell people where we can find that?
pretty much anywhere, I think. Well, Ruth has one. Ruth got a copy.
And it goes everywhere I do when I make a presentation, trust me.
That's very kind of you. Yeah, well, I really feel for the independent booksellers, and I've had such a hard time during the pandemic. So if you can buy one from an independent bookseller, go for it. Otherwise, it's the usual suspects, the big A, Amazon and friends. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Gene, why do plants need pollination?
Well, they need pollination because they need to have diversity. They need to be able to get the genetic material that allows them to specialize to their own little niche. And they need to get that from someplace a little bit further away. So that transfers the genetic material. It allows them to adapt and better survive in their own particular little climate or microclimate. They survive their own other problems that way.
Great. And Jackson, do you have a comment?
A friend of mine or associate of mine is Dr. Alex Liu from the Harvard School of Public Health. And he actually testified about chemicals, lawn chemicals and pesticides, and that are killing off, pollinators and butterflies, etc. And he said that if we don't curb these lawn chemicals, that the pollinators could die off, and then most of the food that we humans depend on would be gone within 3 years. So it's a very important thing that we protect our pollinators for the survival of the plant. After his testimony to protect pollinators, and they banned lawn care chemicals and weed and feed products for all of Europe.
Great. Thank you. I must admit that most of what all of you said was new to me, so I'm learning a lot already. And our next question is going to be, can you talk about the misconception of grass not attracting pollinators? And let's start with Jackson.
Hi there. I want to talk about what harms pollinators and protects pollinators. And it's very not often discussed. People don't understand this. There's both good grass and bad grass. However, from all the chemicals, of the fertilizers, the pesticides, especially weed and feed products, is the worst. And lawn chemicals can increase the risk for 12 different diseases for humans, everything from learning and behavioral disorders for children to increasing the risk of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, sexual dysfunction, cancer, and leukemia. But also it harms animals and contributes to killing off 3 billion song and migrating birds in the last few number of years. And it's also killing off the bees and pollinators and butterflies. Basically, you never want to use lawn chemicals, especially ones with pesticides, the weed and feed stuff, and you want to go organic. If you have grass, ideally you want to cut it 3.5 to 4 inches tall with a sharp blade, and you won't have weeds. So you don't need to use chemicals to protect the pollinators. And you leave the clippings, and you use organic fertilizer only, not chemical fertilizer. And one thing that's commonly not known is you want to fertilize after the spring rain and after the fall rain, because the rain washes the nutrients out of the soil. And leaves. The thing with leaves is you want to leave the leaves. It's one of the most important things that I can say is leaves can be a major part of many problems, and it's also a solution. In fall, you want to rake away the excess leaves into a big piles on your property. And the pollinators go there to winter over. And if you're wondering why you don't have a lot of pollinators in the spring, it's probably because you don't have a leaf pile. And and for them to winter over. The last two mowings that you do, you want to, with a mulching blade, mow the clippings into the grass so they stay on the lawn. It fertilizes the grass, it helps grow the roots, and it also helps grow more worms for the migrating birds. And again, you leave the clippings to add the nutrients to the ground. And most people don't know this, but that we take away in the United States 10 million tons of leaves every fall that go to landfill, which is 8% of all landfill. So if you just leave the leaves on the property, leave all the organic stuff on the property, either mulched into the lawn or in a pile for wintering over. So that is the basis on leaving chemicals out. I like to talk very briefly about grass, or we can leave it to later.
No, please go ahead.
All right. I've always loved grass, but I've hated just about everything about it. All the chemicals, the water, the effects on animals, children, pollinators. So back in 2000, I hired 4 PhDs who were some of the top scientists in the world in turf science, and we grew over 10,000 experiments, and we developed this breakthrough grass called Pearl's Premium Ultra Low Maintenance Lawn Seed, which is all natural. It's non-GMO. Most of the seeds were here in North America before the American Indians, but it's in exact proportions. It grows very slow, so you mow it only once a month instead of once a week. It grows 4-foot roots, so it needs 75% less water. It outcompetes most weeds naturally without chemicals. It stays green year round. It never goes brown in the heat of summer or the cold of winter. And importantly, it from the deep roots, it sequesters 8 times the carbon of ordinary shallow root grass to help lessen climate change and extreme weather. It doesn't spread sideways. So wherever you put the seeds, that's where it grows, but it doesn't spread into your flowers or your vegetable garden. And we've had over 300 rave reviews by the experts, and we won an award from the Boston Museum of Science for being one of the 3 most important patented inventions to ever come out of New England, although it grows everywhere. And something that's interesting is that 2 of the 7 seeds in the mix have a naturally occurring fungi that grows on it that gives off a smell. Humans can't detect the smell, but bugs can. So it turns out that this smell keeps away most of the bugs that attack the grass, and it doesn't eliminate, but dramatically lessens mosquitoes and ticks. But it doesn't affect pollinators and butterflies at all. So that's all part of the mix of the grass, to have a better grass that supports pollinators, but slightly dramatically lessens mosquitoes and ticks. And it's called Pearl's Premium Ultra Low Maintenance Lawn Seed. And if people want to buy any, it's 10% off if you use the term of this talk. Science Cafe.
Great marketing tool. Thank you.
I'd love to interject a different opinion.
Please.
Sure.
So in my parlance, being a native plant person, that's my expertise. I think it's really important to be focusing on native plants that support pollinators, and certainly non-native turf does not do that. We do have native grasses that are really useful. Some of our bunch forming native grasses are very useful as a habitat for some ground nesting bees. And let's talk about bees for a sec. So the vast majority of our native bees are nesting in the ground. The vast majority, about 70%. The balance are cavity nesters. So they're going to be going to pithy stems, hollow plant stems that you may be leaving up during winter, that kind of thing. You'll see a lot of other invertebrates like butterflies in various stages, including in some cases with certain species, even adult butterflies may overwinter in leaf litter. But my goal, one of them, is to get people to reduce the lawn. What I tell folks is to keep the lawn you really use, whether you play on it, your dogs go on it, your kids go on it, or so on, and lose the rest. And whatever you keep, manage it organically. But in my practice, I'm always trying to get people to get rid of the lawn and to plant a diverse array of native plants that support a diverse array of pollinators.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Ruth or Jean, would you care to comment?
Well, just two quick ones. One is a little pithy little saying on what Kim was saying. The idea, we were sort of all brought up with this idea that the lawn is basically your wall-to-wall carpeting. And as I tell people, no, think of that as your scatter rugs. Little patches of lawn where and what you need them for, and that's really all you need. And then to take a slightly different perspective on it, I'm not a fan of lawns in particular anyway, but if you are going to have a grassing area, I agree not using the chemicals, but there are value to what we've perceived as weeds. One is the pormaline dandelions. Granted, they are not native, but at one point they were a valued imported landscape flower. At some point in time, we decided we didn't like them, and people approached them with a vengeance, everything, including a flamethrower, when actually they are very, very important early nectar plants for bees. Again, not native, but I guess if you're going to have a lawn and they show up, my point is to keep them. And the same thing with the clovers, another non-native plant, but early in the season, those clovers are critical, especially for your overwintered queen bumblebees in particular, need that early nectar. And so part of the idea of a lawn is not only rethinking what it's comprised of and how much of it, but don't think of them as weeds. As Martha Stewart cleverly marketed them, they're flowering lawns. So it's a different way of looking at it, but a very, very valid one and quite beautiful.
Okay, thank you. Jean, anything to add?
I would just agree that a diverse lawn with a number of different kinds of plants, not just grasses, what survives the best and does provide for all the rest of Mother Nature out there. Whether you actually rip up parts of the lawn to put in gardens, vegetable, flowers, native plants for the pollinators, or whether you just let the seeds germinate that are out there.
Yeah.
Some people call that weeds, but it's only a weed if it's out of place.
Can I give a shout out for violets?
You sure can.
Because violets are really important and people constantly remove them. And it's ridiculous because, it's basically free ground cover that happens to provide some nectar. And also, most of our violets are host plants for fritillary butterfly caterpillars. So for folks that don't know about host plants, virtually all of our butterflies and moths in the caterpillar stage are feeding on plant leaves. And sometimes it's a very specific species. Sometimes it's broader, but monarchs and milkweeds are kind of a classic example. So one of the reasons that we have lost so much of the population of fritillary butterfly species is because we keep removing violets from our landscapes. But I do want to give a shout out for the co-evolutionary associations between native plants and our native pollinators. Pollinators are opportunists and they will use plants that are available to them. They'll even go to plants like Japanese knotweed quite happily if there's nothing else around. They're not making a judgment about whether a plant's good for them. They're hungry. They're looking for food resources. Nectar for energy, pollen for protein. They're both really important. So, if we plant more appropriately with the plants that they need, and in fact, 25% of our native bee species are specialists on the pollen of particular native plants. And it goes beyond that. There are quite a few species that have preferences of nectar and pollen, even if they don't specialize in the pollen of particular plants. So part of the conversation has really got to be about native plants,
And so how would we know, like for me, I don't know a lot about this. How would I know what's a native plant versus a non-native
Well,
plant?
you guys are in luck because the Native Plant Trust, which used to be called the New England Wildflower Society, is I call it the grandmommy of native plant organizations in the Northeast. The Native Plant Trust has just a fantastic website with a plant search tool. And you can take a look, and filter by different features, color, time of, flowering, etc., and come up with a good list of plants that are suitable for what we call your ecoregion. So this is kind of a different. The ecoregions are defined by the EPA, and it's a little bit different way of looking at our geographic landscapes. Instead of using political state boundaries, which are kind of meaningless, we're looking at ecoregions and what's native to an ecoregion. So Native Plant Trust, join them. They're a fantastic nonprofit. Go visit them in Framingham. Their display gardens are wonderful.
Great, thank you. Jackson, did you want?
Yeah, I agree. You should minimize your grass, and most grass is terrible. And it actually, a lot of the grass, the yellow-green grass, came from the coast of Europe, brought over by the chemical companies during the 50s. And 5 of the 7 seeds in our particular Pearl's premium grass actually were here before the American Indians. It is native. And the last 2 seeds have been here for over 100 years and have adapted to our environment. So it's mainly native. But I want to mention clover. Clover is a great thing. All grass seed before the 50s had clover in it that would naturally pull nitrogen out of the air and release it into the soil to fertilize the soil. And then the chemical companies came along, and when they discovered the chemical fertilizer, which came from some of the Nazi research, and they could sell something that they could repeatedly sell over and over, they left the clover out of the grass seed mixes and started selling chemical fertilizer, which you don't need. So go with clover. And the only thing about clover is it will take over your lawn over time. So you want to use minimal amounts, 2 to 3% by weight compared to grass seed. So a small amount of clover, otherwise a large amount of clover takes over your lawn over time.
Okay. Now, our next question is, other than bees, what are some common pollinators that we would find here in the Northeast? And why don't we start with Kim?
Okay, so there are a lot. I mean, when we think about it, we've got 4,000 native bees in the United States. In the Northeast, depending on your state, like my state of New York has about 400 species. Probably in most of New England states, closer to 300 species, depends on the size of your state. So you've got a lot of native bees just from the get-go. And they vary in their coloration, their body size, their body strength, their tongue length, which all are determinants in terms of which plants they can utilize. Obviously, we talk a lot about butterflies, but what people may not realize, we have many, many more moth species in North America than we do butterfly species. And they're really, most of them are very important pollinators. There are some moths that don't feed as adults. Our silk moths are in that category. They don't have proper mouth parts to feed as adults. They get everything they need when they're in the caterpillar stage. But moths and butterflies have really not gotten their due. And as research continues to evolve, and let's go for more grants, folks, the scientists need them, we're learning more. And I'll just give you an example of a study that was published in 2015 by North Carolina State. And it was on the pollination of flame azalea, Rhododendron calendulaceum. Now, we've always thought of butterflies as not being very good pollinators. They're not fuzzy. They don't carry a lot of pollen in their bodies. They don't rub up into the flowers like bees do. But this study out of NC State on a rare case of wing pollination found that swallowtail butterflies are the best pollinators of flame azalea. Why? Because they have a behavior where they flap their wings while they're nectaring, releasing the pollen. So that really humbles me in terms of appreciating how many subtle co-evolutionary interactions are happening that we don't even see. Of course, beetles. Beetles provide a lot of pollination service. They're really feeding on pollen. They're not interested in nectar. They're most important in the tropics for pollination of food crops. But we have a lot of beetle pollinators around. Wasps can be very important pollinators on particular plants. Again, they don't have fuzzy bodies like bees, so they don't pick up quite as much pollen. And even flies, we have quite a few species of extraordinarily pollinators that are flies, not all flies being pollinators, but if you've ever seen a hoverfly, little tiny insect that looks like a tiny bee hovering over your flowers, it's probably one of those hoverflies. And in other parts of the country, in the Southwest, bats, there are 3 species of bats that are active pollinators, but not in this part of the country.
Okay, Jean, other than bees, what are some common pollinators we would find up here?
Well, I was going to mention the dipter of the flies that she was talking about, but we also have the hummingbirds up here. And
Yeah, I forgot hummingbirds.
hummingbirds, okay, there's a lot of different things out there that will move around, and even just the humans can brush some pollen from one flower to another. So you have to open your mind up. Anything that's moving from one plant to another, one flower to another, can transfer the pollen.
Interesting. Okay, Ruth?
I think they've covered pretty much the list. I was kind of checking them off as we went along, and they hit all of them. But I think, Kim mentioned it briefly at the end. There is this perception that anything which flies and has yellow and black coloring, therefore to it must be a bee. And you need to learn a little bit more about it. And a lot of these smaller flying insects that we automatically assume are bees are in many cases types of flies. And there's also sort of the mindset that if it's a wasp, it's a horrible thing that will sting you and has, no pollinating value whatsoever. And actually some of the scariest looking wasps are some pretty good pollinators. So it's a much broader spectrum of pollinators out there than what are the most common and most popular ones.
They're a good pollinator, but they also bite you?
Some do, but for the most part, the pollinators aren't interested in making lunch out of you. That's one distinction. The honeybees have a collective hive with thousands of bees in the hive. They're protecting 2 things. They're protecting their queen, and they're protecting their honey supply. They're unique in that, number one, honeybees are not native to this country. They were brought over with the Europeans who didn't trust this, maple syrup stuff that came out of trees around here, and they wanted honey in their tea. Thank you very much. So they brought their beehives over with them. I can't even imagine what that was like on that ship, but we won't go there. Those bees are protecting their queen and their honey, and their sting is meant to protect against marauding mammals, of which humans happen to be them. Some of your native bees, a few of them live in colonies of perhaps 100 of them, but none of them are protecting a honey supply. Honeybees are really the only ones that do honey. And they're kind of, each queen has her own set of eggs. They're much less communal. They're not out there to stave off someone who's trying to get it all back. They're basically protecting their nest from another insect. So for the most part, their venom also is much less severe to humans than a honeybee venom. So yes, they will sting, but they're usually less protective, which you can translate to less aggressive. And the stings themselves, most people, now people can react poorly to anything. Most people do not react as badly to. So give your bumblebees and your native bees a little extra love.
Okay. Jack?
Let me just mention that I'm hearing feedback. Bumblebees actually will produce honey, but they live in such small groups. 50 to maybe 200, 250 individuals in a colony, mostly mothers and daughters. They make so little that, we can't share it with them. But that's a really key point that, our native bees are primarily solitary, 90% of them. And not only do we need to provide them with food sources in the form of forage, nectar and pollen, and there's some floral oils and so on for certain pollinators, but we need to provide them with habitat, a place to live.
Exactly.
Yeah. And we don't think about that when we're gardening all the time.
Okay, and Jackson, do you have anything to add about common pollinators in this area?
Well, it's already most of what I would say has already been discussed,
Okay.
and the most important thing is just have a wide variety of native plants and native things to increase and protect biodiversity.
Okay, and sort of tethering into that, the next question is, what are some endangered pollinators? Jackson, you want to go?
Um, I'm not an expert on it. Dr. Lou would be a better source of that. But a lot of pollinators, migrating birds, songbirds, are in danger. Um, One of the other people might have better information about the numbers.
Okay, Gene.
Well, I know in my own yard here, both my wife and I have noticed that there's a lot fewer bumblebees around now than there were 10 or 15 years ago. What's happening to all the bumblebees? Again, I have to come back to that whole question of the lawn chemicals. I really don't like seeing a lot of lawn chemicals. Easy to spread them around, but what else are they impacting? What else are they killing? But that's the big one I've noticed around here is the drop in the number of bumblebees.
Ruth, any comment?
Yeah, I with Gene also, it's not just the lawn chemicals, but I have all I can do. My husband has to like hold on to me when we drive by a Mosquito Joe sign or a truck because I'd kind of like to do bodily harm, which is illegal. But I just don't understand the mindset behind some of this because why would you put poison down, basically? And to Kim's very valid point earlier, we do need to think beyond just planting the food, but we need to create habitats. And I sort of use this analogy sometimes is that food is like providing a restaurant. It's a drive-by, you get a good meal and you move on. Or you have the bed and breakfast concept where you've got food, maybe a little water, that's great. You need a habitat. You need the safe place where they can raise their young. You need an environment where they have enough space to shelter and to replicate, and then you need the food and the safe water. That's a home. That's where you raise your family, and that goes beyond just putting down some flowers for nectar and pollen.
Okay, thank you. And Kim.
Yeah, there's more and more research on native pollinators and their decline. It used to be all about honeybees because that was what Big Ag was looking at, right? And there are not that many studies out, but I know that there was a study on historic bees in the Midwest going back 100 years that found that 50% were extirpated, gone. Yeah. And State of the Pollinators is another research paper that came out in 2017. They looked at 1,400 of our 4,000 native bees and found that at least 50% are imperiled or extinct. Or going extinct, excuse me. So, that's just bees. But look anecdotally at butterflies and how few butterflies you see now versus the numbers that you used to see 20 or 30 years ago. Monarchs, obviously, I call them, the tip of the ecological iceberg. They're kind of the poster child for species loss. But if you look at the statistics of invertebrate and vertebrate decline both, which I often use in presentations that I give, it's astounding what kind of species loss that we've seen in the last 40 to 50 years, and it's continuing. And honestly, the only hope we have is to change our practices and wake up because we depend on so many of these pollinators. Not only do animal pollinators pollinate about a third of the world's food crops, but they actually increase the yields of a majority of food crops that don't require animal pollination but benefit from it, which is pretty astounding.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. What does it take to become a New Hampshire pollinator-friendly property?
That's a certification program that UNH has just started in the past 6 months or so. We are coordinating with Maine, a similar climate to our own as well. They developed it's called the Pollinator-Friendly Garden Certification Program. It is an awesome resource, even if you don't wish to certify your garden. it is absolutely chock full of resources on how to improve your property to make it bee friendly. The application has questions and it has a checklist of not only native to New England plants, but specifically plants that are native to this ecoregion that we know are particularly beneficial to our native pollinators. It has a checklist, and we ask you to have 3 different types in each blooming season, which includes herbaceous perennials and something we haven't touched upon very much, but your woody perennials. Your trees and your shrubs are some of the most important pollinator plants that you could have in your property. And you may not realize, Doug Tallamy's work, who's sort of the guru of all things native plants, your oak trees for your woody plants and your goldenrods for your herbaceous plants are really 2 of the best plants that you can have on your property to support the widest number of critters. So the New Hampshire Pollinator-Friendly certification, we have just started certifying gardens in here. We hope to have some display gardens available pretty soon, and it's just hopeful that people, and it doesn't matter, your garden does not have to be many acres. You can have a small garden plot, but if it does contain 3 native plants that are producing in each of the seasons, so early, mid, and late season, and you include things like, you don't use pesticides and chemicals, you do leave the leaves, you do have a water source, a very important part of a pollinator habitat, a bee-friendly, pollinator-friendly water source, not a swimming pool. If you have sheltered habitats, all of that, it really walks you through step by step how to really have that, what I was talking about, a pollinator home and not just a pollinator restaurant.
That's great.
Excellent. Kim?
Gosh, that's great. We don't have this kind of certification in New York, which is depressing, but we do have the Pollinator Pathway movement, which started in Connecticut, just a county away from where I live, and that is spread to I think 11 states, including New Hampshire, as I understand it. And this is a movement to try to create connectivity between landscapes, and you might kind of relate to that connectivity term as it pertains to megafauna, particularly out in the West, where you've got big critters trying to cross highways. There's been a longstanding practice of trying to create, routes, safe routes, like overpasses over highways and stuff. Well, we can take that same concept and apply it to pollinators, and connect our landscapes one to the other, the next to the next to the next, to ramp up the resources for pollinators and give them a safe place to be and a place to eat, place to live, and so on. So kudos to New Hampshire for getting serious about this. It's really great.
Great. Jean, this sounds like a question that might be well suited for you. How does New Hampshire become a pollinator-friendly property?
The big thing is to increase diversity in your own garden. I hate the monoculture of a lawn. Put in a much more diverse area. Sure, have your patch of lawn, but have some flowers. Let some of the weeds grow in the lawn. Let some of the shrubs grow on the sides so you get some different height variations that buffer some of the wind, because not all the insects can fly very fast or very strong. So you want to get the diversity in there. And you want to have, as they were saying before, bloom times over the seasons, because not everything is around all the year. Some of the insects are only out there for 6-8 weeks max. And if you hit the wrong 6 or 8 week period, you're not going to be able to have them survive. Finally, what I will say is that one thing I've seen at Nashville Farmers, at the store itself, we are right next to the railroad tracks, and we used to see the monarchs in October coming down the railroad tracks because of all the diversity along the tracks where they weren't managing things. You had native shrubs, native plants growing there, semi in the wild, and the monarchs would be coming down every fall. You could see them. I didn't for a while, but this past year I did see probably 15 to 20 monarchs going by the store.
Good.
Interesting.
That's great.
Okay, and Jackson, do you have a comment on that?
Well, everyone else has said a lot of it. But again, it's diversity. Having some areas just natural, native, that you don't cut, you don't do anything, and to have a small pollinator and just 20 or 30 square feet of a diversity of flowers can make a big difference. And also, again, a leaf pile and not taking away the leaves, mowing them into your lawn. And again, what other people have said, you minimize your lawn, have a bunch of diversity.
Okay, great. Thank you. No, go ahead.
Could I just add something? So I've got a couple of principles in my book that maybe might be helpful for people. And one is to create a succession of bloom. And that's including woody plants, trees, shrubs, vines, as well as herbaceous plants, flowering perennials, native grasses, and so on. But a succession of bloom from very early spring. And some of those key plants are going to be things like red maple and our willow species, et cetera. And continue that bloom with at least, in even the tiniest landscape, at least 3 native plants that are diverse in bloom at the same time, all the way through late fall. We would really want to ramp up the goldenrods, like Ruth said, and the asters and so on, and not just one species of these. Like in my own landscape, I live on 1/5 of an acre, guys, feel sorry for me. But I've got 4 or 5 species of asters and goldenrods each to ramp that up. And then the other principle is what I call achieving floral balance, this balance between plant diversity and plant sufficiency. So the diversity is kind of obvious because we have different pollinators seeking out different resources, different times of year, and able to access different plants, different flowers. But the sufficiency is planting enough of a given species so pollinators can find it and use it. And there's some research at a University of California, Berkeley Bee Lab some years ago that found a 1 square meter patch of a single plant species was an ideal target. But not all of us can do that. So we can kind of compromise and create repetitions of smaller groupings, or we can even go in the direction of what I call a meadowscape, a meadow-like garden or a proper meadow, where that repetition of bloom just works out fine for things like bees and butterflies that have a behavior called floral constancy. So when they go out to eat, they're looking for the same species for each foraging mission, and they may make dozens of foraging missions during the day.
Okay, thank you. So our next question comes from Kathleen from Derry. Are non-native honeybees necessary to pollinate crops, or could native bees do the job? Ruth, would you like to take a swing at that?
Yeah, this is an area of a fair amount of contention because there's on the one hand, there's the feeling that there's competition between the honeybees and the native bees in certain circumstances, and that's very true. In terms of agriculture, though, there are some crops that the honeybees in larger numbers are probably more effective cost-wise. One of the key factors, though, and this is particularly true, let's say up in the blueberry barrens of Maine, it depends upon the pollinator itself and their foraging range, because a honeybee will actually forage for miles. So if you have hundreds of acres of, unfortunately, one plant, as they do in many crops, a honeybee can cover that. Your bumblebee will only travel maybe half a mile or so to a mile. So obviously their foraging range is much more limited. Now, when it comes to something like apples and pears, which we have more of here in New Hampshire, our orchard fruits, our mason bees are more likely to be pollinators, and they only forage for a few hundred yards, as much as maybe 900 yards. So their limited foraging is much closer. So in some regards, it actually makes more sense to use them in an orchard, because if you have mason bees at one end of your orchard, they're going to be foraging right around them where your trees are, which is where you want them. If you have honeybees in your yard, which I did for a while, it's great, and I'm certain that my plants benefited for them. But because honeybees also need so much more nectar and pollen, because they are creating all that honey to winter over in large numbers, they're going to be foraging for miles away. They're not going to stay in your yard. So your honeybees are benefiting people, within miles around you. It also means they're being exposed to what people are doing miles around you as well, and that's another issue.
Okay. Gene, do you have an opinion on this one?
I would agree that having a colony of honeybees is important if you have an intense crop. But as you diversify, as you get further out, the native bees and stuff will do an excellent job in a small area. If you are trying to do a 100-acre field, a 100-acre orchard, yes, now you have to start bringing in the colonies, the beehives, to get them all pollinated, because you're doing it in a short period of time. The native bees have a hard time over that. But if you have a good diverse yard, a good diverse garden, then the cucumbers are not blooming at the same time as the summer squash, or as the eggplant and everything else. And the native pollinators can move around and pick and choose and help pollinate things as they are ripening.
Interesting. Jackson, do you have an opinion?
Going last on the questions, everyone else has already covered everything. But again, the same answer is diversity. Having a small amount of a wide array of things, and again, you don't need a huge area. Just like 30 or 40 square feet can do a great job of supporting pollinators and migrating birds and so on.
I promise you'll be first on this next question.
Can I make a comment about that particular issue about honeybees? So I really encourage everybody to take a look at the film, the documentary called The Pollinators. Peter Nelson, who's an extraordinary filmmaker who produced a film some years ago about the Adirondacks, which was award-winning, also produced this film. I've got an interview with Peter on my website and some clips from the movie. And you will want to cry at how inhumane and heartbreaking our commercial honeybee management is, and the devastating toll that is taken on honeybees. Even though they're not native, you got to feel for them. So what's really broken is our big agricultural system. Transporting millions and millions and millions of honeybees across the country to pollinate crops doesn't make a lot of sense. So there is a big movement for regenerative agriculture. It's going to be a slow process, but there are a number of pretty important folks in my neck of the woods who are advocating and trying to put regenerative agriculture in practice. And I think that's the way we need to be going.
Thank you, Kim. Okay, the next question is from Mary Tebow. Can you mention the important role of trees for pollinators? And Jackson, would you like to take this one?
I'm sorry, say again?
Can you mention the important role of trees for pollinators?
I'm not an expert on trees. I know more about plants and grass and things like that. So maybe someone else could cover trees.
Ruth, you seem to be shaking your head yes?
Mary would shoot me if I didn't answer this one. So yeah, Mary heads the Natural Resource Stewards Program. So trees, as I mentioned earlier, are critical for a variety of reasons. One is just sheer volume. If you're going bang for the buck, shrubs and trees are definitely going to give you a large amount of density in one spot for a particular amount of time. Trees are multi-purpose. Not only do they provide pollen in many cases, they provide it earlier in the season. If you think of things like the willows, the redbuds, the amelanchier, which is the shade bush, all of those are very, very important early season. They provide shelter, windbreaks, and I think Kim mentioned earlier that some of our butterflies do overwinter, one being the mourning cloak. They do overwinter as adults, which is unusual up here, and they will nest in the cracks and the crevices in some of our more rough-barked plants. So the trees are critical throughout the season.
Okay, great. Kim.
Yeah, and of course, the houseplant part of this, right? So many of our host plants or native host plants are trees and shrubs. That's the big thing with oaks, number one, and then we get to prunus, the cherries, and related beach plums and so on, and willows right up there. Really, really, really important host plant. So it's important to look at the full ecological services that a plant is providing. Not just the fact that it delivers nectar, for example. And that's often what gets us into trouble when we think that all plants are equivalent, native or non-native, invasive versus whatever. We really have to look at the full ecological function and what plants are doing.
Great. Thank you. And Jean.
A tree is rather large, as they were saying. You have to look at the entire aspect of that tree and what is provided for the pollinators. It is providing a hiding place from some of the predators. It is providing the nectar or the pollen at a different time of the year because the trees bloom earlier or later. But one of the other things it does provide is protection. It buffers the wind so the pollinator doesn't get blown out of the field so fast. Here in New Hampshire, we're 80% wooded, and many people don't realize that you go up into the canopy of a tree, it looks a lot different up there. You see a lot of things up there you don't see down on ground level. My house right here, we have 3 stories high, and I can go look out one of the windows on the 3rd story, and I'm looking into a tree 40 feet off the ground, and I see many different things that you don't see when you're just walking around 6 feet off the ground, the normal human height.
Wow, great. Okay, thank you. Next question is from Sandy Belknap, a close friend of Science Cafe. What is the most unique critter that is a pollinator that may surprise us? And Jackson, we'll start with you.
I don't, I know all the common pollinators, but I'm not sure which is surprises us. I'm sorry that, someone else can maybe answer that better.
That's okay. Kim?
Well, there's documentation that mosquitoes, some species of mosquitoes are pollinators, which is kind of weird. None that I know of here in North America, but in other countries, there's some reptiles that provide pollination services, some large mammals. I mean, there are all sorts of things like, was mentioned, just brushing up against pollen from one flower and then brushing up the next can provide a pollination service. So maybe your cat or dog is a pollinator in disguise.
Okay. Jean, what pollinator might surprise us?
I think you might be surprised if you start looking at some of the mice. You don't think of them, but again, they have that nice soft fur. They can catch the pollen, and they're running around back and forth among the low plants. That, I think, would be the most surprising one.
Okay. And Ruth, what do you have for surprises?
I would say some of those scary looking wasps that you see late in the season. They can almost terrify you. Some of them are a couple of inches long, kind of a bluish black. And you see them working over some of the larger blossoms, and you think of this, ferocious thing, and actually they're rather terrific late season pollinators.
Okay. Let's see. We have a question here from Erin Morehouse. I live in a condo complex and don't have much control over what is planted. What small things can I do to encourage a pollinator-friendly yard? And Jackson?
You could just hijack some plants and just don't ask permission. Just worry about forgiveness. And no one will complain about a flower. So you buy or get some pollinating flowers and plants and just stick them out there where people aren't going to trample them. Just do it.
Okay. Ruth?
I've come across this, and I think one of the best things you can do in that situation is try maybe to do some education. There's been a fair amount of backlash against some of these fairly, may I say, ridiculous guidelines that some of the homeowner associations have put in place for landscapes that are labor intensive, cost intensive, water resource using, and practically useless. And as more and more information is getting out there about the importance of using native plants and how it can be beneficial in so many ways, I think taking the time and effort to try to get other like-minded individuals in the association to make the case with the condo association, especially if you can point out that in the long run, it's probably going to save them some money. But in the meantime, size doesn't necessarily need to be a deterrent. If you can put a couple of good-sized containers on a porch or a patio, it's not ideal, but it certainly is something. If you can work with your foundation planting to put some good pollinator plants around them, and maybe one or two spring flowering shrubs, because a lot of the flowering shrubs do pass muster with these homeowner associations just because they are pretty. You can work around it, and there's a lot of resources out there that you may be able to use either for education for the homeowners association or to help you make some selections yourself.
Okay, thank you. Kim, what do you think we could do?
Yeah, those are great tips. Great tips. Education is so important. And, I do a talk, great native plants for containers. There's a lot you can do. A lot of my students are in Brooklyn, in really small spaces. So you can do a lot with containers and native plants. But what I'd suggest is, see if you can get agreement to let you, put in a small garden, just kind of an experimental pollinator garden, and include signage. I think signage is grossly underutilized, and it gives a clue to folks why you're planning in a certain way. And when they start to see butterflies show up and even bees, people now understand, oh yeah, pollination we want to eat. Some good signs: the Xerces Society, XERCES. Obviously, the New Hampshire certification program would be a go-to. Pollinator pathway, but signage, we call that a cue to care, and that comes out of research done by Joan Iverson Nassauer going back to the 80s, that if we use cues to care like signage, like some sort of intention that we're showing that we have an intent to take care of the landscape, that we have a purpose, that passersby are much more accepting of more naturalistic landscapes. So go for the signage.
Okay, and Jean, what do you think we could do at condo complexes?
The first thing I would do is be following up with what Ruth said. I would try to get on the board of directors of the condo association so I can start to control a little bit of it. When you start trying to put your own plants out, I would really be looking at more like hanging basket plants and stuff to get them up off of the lawn, out of the area that the chemicals that the association is using anyways, to try and be able to have these in. There are other little things that you can do, but try to get on the board of directors and vote out all that chemical stuff.
Okay. All right, thank you. We've gone a little bit over our allotted time, so we're going to ask one last question for everybody. And the final question is going to be, if you could name one thing that you would like our audience to remember and take away from this session, what would that one thing be? And Ruth, we'll start with you.
I guess I would tell people not to be intimidated. You don't need a large space, as we just talked about. A small change does make a difference. Mm-hmm. So if you can make a better choice and then build on that success, and then share that with other people, you are starting to create a movement. And there's a quote, if I could do, by the Dalai Lama, which says, if you think if you're small, that you're insignificant, try sleeping with a mosquito.
Thank you. Jackson.
If there's only one thing, don't use lawn care chemicals. That you can have as nice or nicer grass, nicer plants, nicer everything with organic methods. And there's a fallacy that floats around that a lot of people think that a organic lawn or organic flower bed can't look great. It can look really great. So it's a matter of just convincing them or showing them that you can have a beautiful organic lawn. And again, don't take the leaves off the property. Keep them on the property. Keep everything organic on the property.
Great, thank you. Gene, one last thing you'd like people to take away.
Diversity. I hate monoculture. Let's go with diversity.
I love it.
And Kim, what would you say?
So I always tell my students and my audiences that think of your landscape not as a garden, but as an ecosystem.
Yeah.
And it really, truly matters what you do in that ecosystem for all the life around you that we share the planet with. And every landscape matters.
Great. Thank you so much. And now, as we wrap up, I want to remind our audience that you may rewatch or share this video tonight, starting immediately after we're done on our YouTube and Facebook channels. And you can also take a look at our website, sciencecafenh.org, and you can get a whole list of past sessions that we've done for about 6 years. And if you see one you like, go ahead and take a look at it. And closing, I would like to thank the audience for participating. Thank you so much. We appreciate you spending your time and for submitting your questions for us. And a very special thanks to our panel. They give their time so willingly, and it was great to have not only your time, but your expertise. It was a good learning experience for me. So we certainly thank you so very much for being with us. Thank you. And lastly, our next Science Cafe will be on Wednesday, March 16th, and the topic will be the science of blood donations. And with that, we are done. So until next month, thanks for joining us again, and we will see you later. Good night. Have a good evening.
Right.